Okay, let's go ahead and officially start if you're ready.
Sure.
You good? Okay. Tonight on the PowerScripting podcast, we are very pleased to have with us Mark Kraus. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You have not been on before, right?
I have not been on, no.
I have wanted to get you on for at least probably 3 years because I think I met you at a dinner probably at MVP Summit. So that was back when I was still an MVP. And we were talking about the web commandlets. And you were schooling me on why the ones that you wrote were so much better than the original. And ever since then, I've wanted to get you on. So thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So why don't you tell everybody about yourself? How did you get started in IT?
Sure. So I've been kind of working in IT my entire life. I started doing like computer repairs when I was a kid, right? Just people had computers, they needed repairs. I kind of knew how to do that, so that was something I did. And back in the day, we used to have CRT monitors, and one of the things that I kind of specialized in was fixing CRT problems. That's back when we actually did like repairs on electronics and didn't just throw them out.
Really, you cracked the case,
yes,
and fixed it. Wow,
yeah,
that's crazy. Can you see them when they run at 60 hertz?
I do what?
Can you see a CRT screen when it's running at 60 hertz?
I have no clue.
I can. And it used to drive me crazy. I would go change refresh rates on monitors because I could see it scanning, and my gosh, it drove me crazy.
Yeah, I don't think my vision is good enough for that.
Yeah, I don't miss those.
But yeah, that's where it all kind of started. Fell in love with computers. I did electronic repair as well. I've kind of been all over the stack. I've worked in networking jobs. I've worked in IT support. I've done build and release. I've done IT solutions architecture. So I've kind of done everything from that. And then I started doing more of the software development stuff kind of late. I mean, it's only been the past 5 years that I've been doing any kind of real program coding. But throughout all of it, I've always been scripting, and I've always been cross-platform. So I worked at a web hosting company that was very mixed in all the different Linux distribution and Windows distributions it had. I mean, we were supporting everything from Windows Server 2000 to 2016 when I left.
Oh, wow.
And then every flavor of Linux and BSD clone that you could even imagine, those were supported as well. So when PowerShell became cross-platform, that's when I really hit the PowerShell bandwagon. I've been using it for Windows-related stuff every now and then, but when it started to go cross-platform, that's when I really got interested in it.
So did you end up having PowerShell core in the build process for your Linux boxes and the hosted stuff that you were doing?
So when PowerShell went cross-platform, I was working primarily on the Windows side.
Okay.
But it was exciting me because I was like, okay, finally I have an excuse to use PowerShell and get all the Linux guys to do it as well. So at the time, I was dealing with mostly the Windows side, but after I started doing some classes with some of our Linux guys, they started getting kind of on board. And this is a last company that I worked at. That
okay. So you were actually getting Linux guys on board with PowerShell.
Yeah, it's amazing how much easier it is to teach. So it's a pretty easy language to pick up to be self-taught on.
Sure.
But I think it's an even easier language to teach because it's very forgiving. Even teaching Python requires you to go through a very lengthy spiel about a lot of computer science jargon before you can even make some decent Python code.
Okay.
Whereas PowerShell is like, hey, here's a command that you run. It's like, here you go. So
how long did it take? Did you get resistance? Because I know I'm old enough. I've been in IT long enough to remember the disdain that most Linux admins have for anything Microsoft. And they would hear Microsoft and they would just, laugh or give you the hand or something. So how did that work out?
I had the benefit of the Linux guys that I was working with at the time not being scripters to begin with. So they were very procedural operations guys and infrastructure guys. So at the time, like they needed to learn how to script because they were starting to reach a scale where doing things manually was definitely not working anymore.
Okay.
So I had that benefit of them not really having that built-in bias towards Bash and Perl and all of that. So
nice. But to be fair, we have heard over and over again and seen the chart that PowerShell adoption on Linux has been much faster than it has been on Windows, meaning PowerShell core for people who are not. I'm trying to be good about saying Windows PowerShell when I mean, PowerShell 5.1 and previous and PowerShell for 7 and beyond. But I'm still teaching myself to use that terminology because I'm used to PowerShell being PowerShell.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that has to do with it being a very great glue language.
Oh my gosh!
So we hear this a lot in PowerShell. It's a great glue language, and it really is. So where you find PowerShell and Linux a lot, at least in my experience, has been in the areas where you're trying to automate tasks that will run on Linux. So you're not using it for Linux administration per se.
Okay.
I have not seen it used in that capacity. But what I have seen it done is that if you're going to be doing something that might, like, let's say you're building a Node.js application or a Java application, the tooling around that could be written in PowerShell. And then whether you're building the Windows version or the Linux version, the code can be almost identical. So it saves you a lot of time building in double environments. So that's no surprise to me that it's taking off on the Linux side because things are very cross-platform today. You're building and releasing applications to work on multiple platforms. And generally, you need to build on the native platform that the destination is going to be in because cross-piling, while it's there, it's not fully supported on all kind of scenarios. So being able to take your same Java code and compile it on multiple systems and using the same PowerShell scripting to kind of glue all the in-between tasks and intermediary things like setting the versioning and changing any kind of minor details based off of environments, or even setting the resource identifier, or was it? It's not RID for it's not resource, but whether it's going to be 64-bit or 86-bit, those can all be done really easily in PowerShell. Whereas things like Bash and that, like, you could write it in Bash, but it's not going to run on Windows.
Sure.
You could write it in Node and would run on both, but doing things like determining the architecture that you're building on is very difficult in Node. It's not impossible, but it's not fun. So
would you call that kind of a script, a build script?
Yeah,
typically?
yeah.
Okay.
Kind of like a build script. Generally, you'll see it more like this. In scenarios where I've seen it, tasks within the pipeline are going to be written in script tasks, and the script tasks will be run as PowerShell. So they wouldn't necessarily be files directly in your repository. Sometimes they are, but usually they're going to be tasks that are written as part of your CI/CD pipeline. They might live in something like Jenkins, or they might live in Azure DevOps, and they'll just be discrete tasks within that pipeline that do that kind of work.
Okay. Have you ever used Confluence for a pipeline?
We use Confluence Wiki. Yes. That's our primary wiki platform at LinkedIn.
Sometimes I think we're the only company that uses Confluence for CI/CD stuff.
Yeah, we don't use it for CI/CD, but it is we do use it for the wiki portion. You're talking about Atlassian's Confluence? Or
I think
else?
is it Atlassian? Yeah, I think it's Atlassian.
Yeah. Yeah,
well, wait, no. That's the wrong, it's not Confluence, it's Concourse. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Completely the wrong word. Concourse.
Haven't heard of Concourse, though.
Yeah. That's seems like we're the only company that uses Concourse for CI/CD?
I think I think you'll find that you're probably not alone. There is such a wide variety in CI/CD tooling out there that even in a company my size, you're going to find 20 or so. So there might
Sure.
be a team out there that's using it in LinkedIn, and I wouldn't even know about it. So that's so the diversity of what's in the pipelines and what tech you're using is definitely pretty high, and you can run into those at different companies or even in the same company. So it just depends.
Sure. And I honestly don't know how far Concourse has penetrated, because I know that we were using it and kind of encouraged to use it on the infrastructure side, but in some of the development work that was going on within the infrastructure teams, but outside of that, I don't know. I do know that there's at least one Jenkins instance that I've seen, but who knows what all they're using.
Yep.
But almost everything that I know of that's being developed is being developed in containers. That has become pervasive from what I've seen.
Yeah, it's kind of the turning point for us as well, to move towards containers. And for the longest time, we've had a lot of traditional VI compute, so a lot of VMware based for on-prem. And this is it's important for me to say that at LinkedIn, I work on the IT side of the house. So the applications and stuff I do are generally not customer facing. They support the organization. So a lot of what we've been doing in the past was definitely traditional compute. But the demand for doing containers and building on containers is definitely there. The developers that build our custom internal applications are all about the containers these days, and they're chomping at the bit for us to get AKS out the door for them to deploy on. And they also simplify the CI/CD pipeline quite a bit, because the entire process of building a container is like a miniaturized CI/CD pipeline itself. So it frees up a lot of responsibility onto the developer to what they can do with building that container, and makes it so that if you're responsible for building like pipelines as a service, for example, you have to think a lot less about all the scenarios that are there, because the developers have the flexibility to build their containers the way that they want.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And for our listeners who are still, maybe they have never done anything with containers yet. They've certainly heard about containers by now. How would you compare like a container to a virtual machine, which, I would think all of our listeners would be very knowledgeable about what a virtual machine is?
So I'll be quite honest, I'm not an expert on containers myself, but I always see them as kind of mini virtual machines.
Okay.
From a compute aspect, you don't really see a difference. If you were to build a application on a VM that you couldn't log into, for example, and you had to write a script that would run the application when the VM started up, and you couldn't log it and make any changes to that, and you expected that VM to never be around. From a compute standpoint, there's not much difference between a VM and a container. What really does change, though, is kind of the life cycle of a VM and a container. You don't expect a container to exist for 4 years while you update and patch the underlying OS and apply security fixes to it and all that stuff.
Sure.
And instead, what you would be doing in VM speak would be like building a whole new VM with the patches already in it and then replacing the existing one. So it's they look, if you squint, they look like VMs.
Okay.
They're fundamentally different at a lot of really low-level things, but from a compute aspect, they're very similar to VMs.
One description I've heard is you can think of a virtual machine. A virtual machine virtualizes the hardware. And a container, from the application's perspective, virtualizes the operating system.
Yep.
So it thinks it's running on its own operating system, but it's really kind of running on a shared core piece of operating system that has virtualized registry and storage and, whatever OS type stuff the application requires. Would you say that's a good description?
I would say that's a very good description. And containers is a very apt term for them instead of like mini VMs or tiny computer, something like that. I don't know. There could have been a lot of other things, but if you think of them as containers for an application, it makes sense because it needs to contain all of the prerequisites that this application has. Now, in a traditional world where you had a VM, you might have multiple applications run it. You might have the foo app and you might have the bar app, and they might have different requirements. We ran into this the other day where we had an application that when we installed it, it rolled back Git to version 1.6, which then broke things. And that's because another app on there requires Git 2.6 to be installed. And this is problematic on a VM because all these different dependencies between the different applications that are running on there cannot match up, and then it would break one after the other. So in a container, you can basically install all of the prereqs that your app needs, and it runs just in that container. But then you can run multiple apps on the same VM or physical hardware because they're running in different containers, and those dependencies aren't going to overlap.
Okay. And then there's things like Kubernetes, I know is big now, which is some kind of container management technology that handles spinning up containers, building them, the networking type stuff, all of that, the storage.
Yeah. You can think of Kubernetes as like the vCenter of the container world, or Hyper-V orchestrator or something like that. So it works very much the same way in that like it tells where the container comes online, how many of them, what networking settings it has, and it just kind of further abstracts the layers of network and compute, so that the container doesn't have to think about those, but it handles all the scheduling of those coming online, watching to see if they're live and replacing them if they do, and then managing the rolling updates and rollbacks of when you replace containers with new versions and stuff like that. So
does it also handle scaling up, scaling down, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it handles the entire scaling of that. And the network layer, there's it's called like mesh. I forget the full name of it, but again, I'm not a full expert on this. I've got a couple of guys I work with that are starting to really dig into the AKS stuff for how we do that. My focus has been primarily on the CI/CD aspect. So for me, the interesting thing about Kubernetes is how we get applications on it.
Okay.
And how we build those applications and build the containers and get them there. So that's been my kind of focus. I know of the Kubernetes stuff more of a high level, like, hey, I read the AKS documentation on docs.microsoft.com. So
when did you start getting involved in the PowerShell community? How did that start?
It was very much around the same time that PowerShell Core was coming out.
Okay.
I was, like I said, I was teaching some of our teammates how to script, and I chose kind of PowerShell, and then to kind of like learn how the language works a little better, I spent a lot of time starting out in the PowerShell subreddit.
Okay.
And I just was answering questions and all that stuff, just constant 24/7. I mean, I think if you look at my Reddit history, it's just dominated with PowerShell subreddit posts. And then I started to blog a little bit, and then I was interested in PowerShell Core, and then suddenly I ran into an issue with the web commandlets. And when they weren't doing what I was doing, I was like, hey, they open sourced this. I can fix my own problems now. So let me go learn C# right quick so I can make PowerShell better. So that was kind of the progression there. And then I spent a lot of time working on the PowerShell web commandlets, taking feedback from the community, working on long-standing issues that many people have faced on that, and just really focusing on making those commandlets better. And I feel that I succeeded in making them much better than they were in Windows. They're not perfect. And one criticism that we get a lot is that it doesn't support HTML parsing, which was reliant on Internet Explorer. And obviously, that's not going to be there in like a Linux machine or a Mac machine. So I never did get around to making that work because the dependencies for it were just a little wonky. There's AngleSoft is one option. I've seen HTML agility pack. So there's a lot of things that we could have done to kind of do it, but choosing the right one is tricky. When you have a project like PowerShell, taking a dependency on other projects for the .NET pieces starts to make it a little muddy. Because then we're kind of tied to what they have. And then we run into things all the time. Since Newtonsoft was what we were using for kind of the JSON conversion, when you try to import any kind of .NET modules, which you can always do in PowerShell, you can like do some raw .NET operations. But if they relied on a specific version of Newtonsoft, you're kind of screwed in that. You couldn't do much about it. So they were very cautious about taking in third-party dependencies for that reason. It just kind of ties the ecosystem down. So that was one fair bit of criticism about it, but I feel that we kind of nailed it. Performance is way better on the web commandlets. The testing for the web commandlets was, at least when I last looked, it had the best code coverage of any other piece of the PowerShell commandlet space.
Wow.
And a fair bit of work was done into making that so that when we made changes to the web commandlets, and we were making them pretty frequently there at the beginning of PowerShell core, we had a high confidence that it wasn't going to break anything else when we did that.
So can you talk about some of the issues with the Windows PowerShell web commandlets and why they're better now? I think that those commandlets in particular, in an area where you're using PowerShell as a glue, and so much of that now involves, making REST connections and that sort of thing. To me, that's a strong reason to consider, even if you're a Windows guy, looking at PowerShell and its benefits over Windows PowerShell.
Mm-hmm. I think the key things was around authentication. So the web commandlets in Windows PowerShell 5.1 and older, they supported basic authentication, but not the kind of basic authentication that most APIs rely on today. So most APIs require you to kind of send your credentials ahead of time. And what the web commandlets in Windows PowerShell 5.1 and older supported was challenge and response, which isn't something that's used a whole lot anymore.
Okay.
And so what we did is we added the ability to, send basic authentication credentials now in a way that made sense to modern APIs. Also, OAuth was kind of taking off, and it's another heavily used authentication mechanism for APIs and other things these days. So we wanted to add some native capabilities to support OAuth. So those being there and taking some of the work away of like manually creating your headers and kind of forcing things through. One of the incidental changes in PowerShell itself that affected the overall performance of the web commandlets was Ilya changed the way that the process pieces work. So the progress bars and stuff that you see when you download anything using the PowerShell, or like a lot of different commands show the progress bars. By default, that's turned on. And when you were downloading something, it would show the progress bar. And it turned out that it wasn't slow to actually download data off of a remote endpoint. It was slow because the progress bar updating was slowing down the pull of the data. So it was kind of like linked in there. So Ilya changed the way the progress system was done in PowerShell to be a little less spammy. And it shot up the download speeds to be almost real time. Like you can't see the difference between downloading a binary with curl or with invoke web request anymore. Whereas before, curl would probably download a 5 gigabyte file in like 1/3 the time.
Yeah, I remember when we spoke years ago, you telling me, turn the progress bar off and you're going to see a huge increase in performance.
And that's the workaround on Windows PowerShell is to disable the progress bars. It seems so silly, but yeah. So those are some of the key takeaways. We made it a little bit easier to use. I feel that the JSON conversion that Newtonsoft is doing is better than the API in .NET that we were using in Windows PowerShell.
Okay.
Which was the one that was built into ASP.NET, I think. And it was riddled with problems, and it was pretty slow, and the performance was kind of poor, and support for various things was pretty low. Newtonsoft was working pretty well with that. So that kind of just, if you're working with JSON endpoints at all, it just shot through the roof in usability and precision.
And what's the story with TLS, like version 1.1, 1.2? I know that in PowerShell, in Windows PowerShell, I've had issues where, if I'm trying to use a invoke REST method against an endpoint that requires TLS 1.2, I've got to do some .NET stuff ahead of time to get it to work.
Yeah, so that's actually a .NET framework limitation, and by default, since .NET framework has been around for a while, backwards compatibility dictated that certain things needed to be turned on by default. So it is something that PowerShell itself could have been updated to do, but by default, 1.0 and 1.1 and SSL3 were actually enabled in Windows PowerShell as a result of those being the default in .NET framework.
Okay.
When we moved to .NET Core itself updated what the defaults were. In fact, it killed SSL 3.0 because it's not a safe thing. And if you still have anything using SSL 3.0, you need to update immediately. It's like it's almost as bad as just running over pure HTTP at this point.
Oh gosh.
So TLS 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2 are on by default, which is great because a lot of stuff like GitHub is a big example of this. They switched to being 1.2 only on their endpoints, and that meant that if you were running any scripts on Windows PowerShell, one day they suddenly broke and you didn't know why, and you got a really cryptically terrible error message as to why it wasn't working. And it was very confusing. And then we just got lucky with .NET Core being like, okay, well, let's put some sanity to this. Let's put some moderns as a default. But the potential is there that in the future, if they decide to maintain backwards compatibility and we start adding like TLS 5, for example, they might still have TLS 1, 1.1, and 1.2 turned on and 5 disabled. But I think we're a ways off from there.
Okay. And is that something that, if they were to change the default, that could be easily updated in the PowerShell code itself to compensate for that, much more so than would have been possible in the closed source version?
Yeah, it would have been even possible to change it in the closed source version of 5.1. It's just one of those things of like the mode of operation that 5.1 is in is more of like critical bug fixes, critical security issues, and any kind of accessibility issues.
Okay.
Kind of the core things that long-term supports tends to come with, whereas this would be the new feature because you can always turn on 1.2 in Windows PowerShell. It's just not on by default, so that would be a feature to add that. And it's it's incentive to move towards PowerShell core. And you're right. In the future, we could, in PowerShell itself, during initialization of the runtimes, set up the defaults protocols to use.
Okay. Well, that's good news.
Yeah.
Eventually we'll need that, probably. So the web commandlets when I think of the web commandlets, I think of invoke web request and invoke REST method. Are there other web commandlets that I'm not thinking of?
Those are the two primary ones. Technically, the convert to and from JSON are also quote unquote web commandlets because the JSON conversion library and methodology in PowerShell is the exact same between invoke REST method and invoke or convert from or to JSON. So those are technically web commandlets just because they share the same source code. There was another commandlet that was not a web commandlet that a lot of people always assumed was, and that was the commandlet in Windows PowerShell that did SOAP APIs. Web service something. I can't even remember what it is. I never
I don't think I even knew about that.
Yeah. And it relied on actually IIS's, the libraries in IIS to do the SOAP translations, and those are definitely not going to be on Linux. So those got lost. New web service proxy was the commandlet. Thanks, Jared. It's terrible. The .NET Core added SOAP APIs in the .NET namespace, but I never wrote commandlets to do that. To be honest, the demand for SOAP commandlets is pretty low. I've had all of 5 people complain that we don't have it, but if it is something that's significant to your organization, definitely open up an issue on the PowerShell GitHub, and that would help prioritize that with the team. But as far as I've seen, demand for SOAP is pretty low.
So is there something coming to replace REST? Or is REST pretty much the standard everywhere for that type of thing?
REST is starting to see competition with gRPC.
Okay.
I'm very new to gRPC myself, but one of the benefits of gRPC is that it forces you to define your models up front. So you can't just do nebulous commits, right? You can't just say, hey, I'm just going to take whatever and then give you whatever. You have to actually define what what the inputs and what the outputs look like up front.
Okay.
And then a lot of languages like C#, which is be running underneath PowerShell, if we ever added gRPC commandlets, it would translate those into actual classes then that you could access the properties on and be able to see all the different stuff that you can with classes. So that's pretty neat a feature. The problem is that it's not exactly compliant with HTTP spec. Which makes it kind of a breaking thing for things like JavaScript-based applications. So anything that's kind of using a JavaScript front end, anything like with your React or Ember or whatever kind of frameworks you're using for web front ends, they would be using REST calls still because they still don't support gRPC.
Okay.
But that should be coming at some point in time. It's all the rage right now, but that's all the rage because Google's making it all the rage, and the G in gRPC is Google.
Okay.
But I think that it has merits because it allows you to stream objects, which is very PowerShell-y. So I see in the future that if anything was going to replace REST in PowerShell, it would definitely be gRPC because we've already been dealing with streaming objects in our pipelines for a long time.
Okay.
Something we're very familiar with.
So are there any other huge benefits that you see of PowerShell over Windows PowerShell, apart from the obvious cross-platform? I mean, that's a huge one, of course. And the web commandlet improvements are a big deal from a performance perspective. What else are you seeing that is a big improvement?
I feel like overall it's a little lighter. I think that they've shaken some of the crust out of it. So one of the problems with software development is that, in Windows PowerShell specifically, is that in order to kind of maintain momentum, you want to maintain backwards compatibility. And that means you have to take poor decisions with you into the future. And PowerShell Core has given us an opportunity to kind of step back and rethink that model. And sure, that means that major versions or even minor versions might include some breaking changes between them. But the benefit is that we don't have to carry bad decisions made a decade ago, or naive decisions is probably the better way to say, because you just don't know. Like when you're designing software, you don't know up front all the use cases, all the things that are going to do it. So you make decisions based off the information you have, and they may not end up being correct. And rather than just create like a million new million new commandlets for different things that might be extremely microscopic, but make it really hard to use PowerShell because you have to figure out which of the 4 million text editing commandlets to use, for example. It allows PowerShell itself to start morphing and changing over time, and on a much tighter schedule than before. So I think that that's one huge improvement. I think that open source of this is something that's a little underutilized. The interesting thing to me is that my entire involvement with the PowerShell web commandlets came from me actually running into an issue with the web commandlets on Windows PowerShell and being like, well, let me just fix that. Like, I feel like as PowerShell becomes PowerShell Core gains in popularity across all this and kind of replaces Windows PowerShell, we'll see an increase in open source contributions to that, and that has tremendous power. Sure. A lot of things that people have wanted in PowerShell for a long time, and the PowerShell team just doesn't have the kind of bandwidth to work on everything everyone wants. And they have to prioritize based off of the things that are the most impactful or have the largest concerns security-wise or whatever else, right? Their hands are kind of tied in the limited resources they have. What this allows the community to do is to step in and be like, hey, a bunch of us want this. This will be great. And companies like LinkedIn or other companies, when they start getting involved, this can start contributing back and actually making an impact on the language on a wide thing. So I think that will start to show as a huge advantage of PowerShell Core, especially once we start getting much greater parity with Windows PowerShell through PowerShell 7.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Most of the stuff that I have done on PowerShell 7 so far has been just based on the fact that I'm using a Mac now as my daily machine, which I chose in order to force myself to start using PowerShell Core. And I haven't deployed it on servers yet to be used, but there's an orchestration tool that we use that I'm the SME for, that is used as the backend for various processes internally, and it's using Windows PowerShell. And I've been working with the vendor to try and get PowerShell support built into that product. So when that happens, I'm probably going to be doing work to migrate my existing code over, which it sounds like the compatibility has gotten so good that the amount of changes I'm going to have to make are going to be minimal, which would be amazing. And then, then I'll get the performance benefit and the ability to use whatever new commandlets, the new way that errors are displayed and that sort of thing, which error display is not that important in orchestration. But, just from a wider perspective, I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Is not, do you not use collect console logging from the orchestration as it's happening, or do you use like a logging mechanism to actually log errors?
So the orchestration tool logs its own errors, and for if I have PowerShell errors that I want to capture, it can capture the PowerShell error stream and store that in a variable that is available to other items within the orchestration. So that's either one of those. And sometimes I will create my own, errors and my own error handling either within the script or within the orchestration itself based on the output that I get to my PowerShell error variable or whatever I call that variable in the orchestration tool.
Yeah, so output of errors is pretty interesting to me because a lot of CI/CD tools, which is what my bread and butter is these days, actually are capturing the console output of the task as it's running.
Okay.
And the kind of default error display is, pretty useless. So we end up having to write a bunch of boilerplate code to make errors more easy to read in that kind of scenario. So I think new error displays is definitely high on our list of features that we would use in things that aren't even console related because it's pretty neat for us.
Are you happy with? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I wanted to answer. Jared asked a question a while back about what would you say Linux-centered people on adopting PowerShell. We're a Windows shop that's growing our Linux footprint, and we pushing Posh. But those diehards want to continue using Bash. Honestly, we had this too. So one of my sister teams is a Linux platform team, and it's filled with a lot of people who have worked in Linux environments for a lot of years. I think combined, it's well over 150 years of experience that they have. And that's a lot of writing Python, a lot of Bash scripts. And I think what sold it for them was how fast our team, which writes a lot of PowerShell, was able to get things off the ground and running. And when they tried to emulate it using Python, they ran into so many problems. So they started to see just the benefits of it from what we were doing and started being curious, like, okay, how are you able to do it so much faster? How are you able to get these things up and running so much faster? So I think just convincing them by example is one way. And now most of that team has taken PowerShell courses.
Okay.
So they've gone out and taken PowerShell 101 courses and all that stuff. Because they've been able just to see the benefits. So you're not going to be able to convince anybody, no matter what fluffy words you want to throw at them. I think most people in IT are going to be interested when they see something work well. They'll want to find out how they can do that themselves or how they can be better at it. So like, I think one of the guys is more motivated, like, well, they're doing great with PowerShell. How can we beat them with Python? So let me see what they're doing in PowerShell and see if I can beat them with Python. When they couldn't, it was like, oh, maybe this PowerShell is not so bad. So I would say that's definitely one way to go about it. Just lead by example.
That's a pretty good testimony because my understanding is that Python is pretty fast with most tasks.
Yeah, Python itself is a pretty fast language for execution, but writing Python scripts to get things done is where the time sink is. So it costs you more in time getting up and running for a lot of things that are relevant to the work we do than PowerShell. Okay.
And Python has a lot of, what do they call their libraries in Python?
I don't remember. I think they're just libraries.
Okay.
But yeah, the pip libraries that they have.
Yeah, my understanding is that there's a lot of functionality that requires those libraries where on the PowerShell side, you just, all that stuff is part of the language.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits is that since PowerShell is built on top of .NET, it gets access to a lot of the .NET framework. So if you want kind of rich objects in Python, which Python works much better as an object-oriented language than PowerShell does, you have to go through a lot of work to make those objects. Whereas like .NET just gives you those types, which have all that stuff built in, and that's pretty cool.
Okay.
So that means that just to build some stuff, you end up like creating code that a lot of other people have created as well, or copy and pasting to make your classes like work, so that when people are consuming your libraries or whenever you're making code, you have to do all that extra work. So it's it ends up being kind of a time sink in that, in my opinion. But Don't get me wrong. I mean, I know this is a PowerShell scripting podcast. I've programmed in Python now longer than I've done PowerShell.
Okay.
So like I'm speaking from experience that I love the language. It's a great language. But if I wanted to get things up and done quickly, I would choose PowerShell. But if I'm looking for raw performance, then that's where I would go as Python.
Okay. That makes sense. Do you see that changing ever?
I don't know. Part of the cost of being a .NET based application like PowerShell is that there's associated overhead and startup costs that really there isn't much you can do about. They could minify PowerShell and provide a very limited subset and use some of the modern features in .NET 3 that would kind of make it smaller, faster, a little bit more efficient. But then you would lose all the functionality that PowerShell provides you because you'd have to limit what commandlets are available.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good trade-off to me.
Yeah. Especially, it might work in something like a Pi or a Nano environment, a very, very tiny compute environment.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But then you're still limited to, the amount of the commandlets you can use and that sort of thing.
Yep.
Probably be good in containers. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, very small environments where you don't need the full functionality. Like, for example, one thing that was discussed quite a bit about PowerShell core was removing the help system by default.
Okay.
It's a huge piece of code that results in a lot of overhead and slowdowns that if you don't need help on like a embedded system or even a like orchestration system, you don't need it there because you're never going to write a help command. You're never going to need to access the git command or git help on anything there. So that's a huge chunk of code that would just like provide a slight performance boost and decrease the size of the application itself by quite a bit.
Okay. So have you done much speaking at conferences?
This past year I did the PS Summit in Seattle, Redmond,
that's
Bellevue.
Right. I was in your session.
And then I was also spoke at PS Conf Asia in Bangalore.
Oh, wow. What was that like?
That was actually a blast. Shout out to all of my Bangalore homies. I got lucky in that our Bangalore office for LinkedIn is like just a few blocks away from the conference venue, which happened to be at a Microsoft office.
Okay.
So I got to spend 2 weeks out there with my LinkedIn team, and then also with the PowerShell users and community leaders out there. So that was great. That was a lot of fun.
Really cool.
It's a very interesting. The cultural differences kind of changed the way that things are approached. A lot less questions asked during sessions themselves.
Okay. A
lot more questions asked afterwards in the halls. And then sometimes the questions could be way bigger. Like they would just come up and ask things like, how do I use PowerShell in VMware? That's like a huge topic. So that was really, really neat to see. But it was everyone was really nice. It was a great time. I'm looking forward. I'm really hoping that I can return to PS Conf Asia. Hopefully it's in Bangalore again, and I can kind of do another tour of both my Bangalore office and the PowerShell conference out there.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah. But more important than my conference speaking, my biggest project this past year for the PowerShell community has been the PowerShell Conference Book Volume 2.
Okay.
Which we finally did release the final edits of at the end of January. So that's live and ready to go. You can get it on LeanPub. We had 40 authors, 40 chapters. It's a massive beast. I think it's like over 600 pages long.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's a huge thing for us. And it covers a lot of really cool topics. There's a lot of names that everyone who's been following PowerShell for any amount of time will have seen bloggers, authors, speakers, forum members, all kinds of people represented from all around the globe. So that's been a huge hit. And then the best thing about that book is that all proceeds go to help the on-ramp program for the PowerShell Summit.
Okay.
So that program provides scholarships to underrepresented demographics in IT to get them free training and all that stuff.
That's awesome. So what role did you play? Did you like edit the book? Oh my gosh, that must have been a huge task.
Yep. Yeah, it was a huge task. I think I was the first person to read the book in totality because of having to read every chapter. So that was fun.
So can you tell us some of your favorite chapters, or would that not be appropriate because people might get offended that you didn't mention their chapter?
I'll mention some of my favorite chapters just because I'm not going to offend anybody. I liked every chapter; they were all great. But the ones that stuck out in my mind was there's one on classes, and that
did Joel write that?
No, the class one is written by, oh man, I had that here. I believe it's Stefan Van Gluick.
Oh, okay.
And then Alexander Holmset did a great one on getting started with Microsoft Graph API and PowerShell. Graph API is something that I worked with quite a bit at my last one. And then Joel Salo's chapter on the tokenizer in PowerShell. Holy crap! That is an insane chapter for if you want some 400 level PowerShell content. That's the chapter to read.
That guy got up to speed on PowerShell like really quick, really deep.
Oh yeah,
he's an impressive guy. Yeah, we had him on at some point. He was talking about. Am I remembering this correctly? Did he do PowerShell koans?
Yeah, he has the koans.
Koans.
Yep.
Yeah.
Koans. I don't know how to say it.
I don't know how to say it either.
But yeah. That's a great chapter on the tokenizer. Those were, but they're all great chapters. Those one just stuck out as like if I got asked the question on a podcast, those were the three that I'd answer.
Okay, fantastic. So he was on episode 323 for anybody who missed that episode and may want to go back and check it out. So what else are you excited about?
So what else am I excited about?
Yeah.
So on the heels of Volume 2, we are starting the planning for Volume 3. So we're going to start getting that out, and we will likely open up a call for authors at the end of March and invite more people in to write some chapters for us and raise more money for the on-ramp program.
So I think, wasn't the first version of that book, I don't want to say limited to, but primarily people who had spoke at Summit? And then last year, was it different? Or is it going to be different for Volume 3?
Yeah, so Volume 1 was primarily like well-established speakers and authors.
Okay.
And MVPs. And then Volume 2, we kind of opened it up and we're like, okay, anybody who wants to write an interesting chapter will select.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, so that's why we have 40 authors. A lot of them are first-time authors. We were a lot more inclusive with people whose language their first language is not English.
Okay.
So that was great. The representation is fantastic for this. So we're looking to kind of continue that on. We probably won't do 40 chapters because it's a heavy editing burden. But we will definitely be opening it up to pretty much anyone who has any topic in PowerShell that they'd like to become an author on. And let me tell you, one of the cool things about being an author on these books is that people buy physical books of this. And when you're out at conferences and stuff like that, they ask you to sign it. I mean, I've never, I wrote a chapter in the last book and I signed probably 20 copies of the book. And I have never had anyone ask for my signature for anything other than a speeding ticket in my entire life. So
that's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have.
So
I think I have Don Jones's. I have a few signatures from PowerShell authors. I have Hal's book. He signed it for me.
that's pretty awesome. So yeah, that's encouragement for new authors to come out and be heard. We definitely want new voices all the time. PowerShell community is constantly changing. We get new blood in all the time. We get existing authors kind of changing their focus all the time, and so it's good to see that change through this book. I hope is what we'll perpetually see through future volumes.
Yeah, that's amazing to me. It seems to me like we're on, I don't know, maybe the third wave of new people coming into the PowerShell community, maybe fourth wave at this point, from, the people that I used to talk to 10 years ago compared to all the people who are involved today. And it's just amazing. It's so awesome. I love the PowerShell community.
Yeah, it is pretty awesome.
So are you speaking at Summit this year?
I am not speaking at Summit this year.
Are you going to be there?
Overlaps. No, I'll be out in Bangalore again at that time. So I unfortunately am going to miss that one. I am hoping to submit a talk and get selected for the other DevOps one that they're holding in Tennessee.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think that I might not be speaking much at PowerShell conferences anymore. My focus has been more on DevOps, and PowerShell is one kind of aspect of that these days. So like my PowerShell specific content these days is pretty limited. Like it's one tool in my toolbox. That's not a crack at it, but I do plan to stick around and help with the PowerShell book, PowerShell conference book, at least for the next 2 volumes. And kind of make sure that we can make that a long-standing thing. And then if I come across anything really interesting, you'll see me maybe pop up at a conference or 2.
Okay. Did you do a chapter for book 2?
I didn't do a chapter for book 2 because I knew I'd be burdened with the editing process.
Sure. So if you want Mark to sign your book, you got to get volume 1, right? And then track him down.
Yeah.
I think I only have an ebook copy of that. I don't think I have a physical copy of that. I almost never get physical copies anymore, unless it's like the Bruce's book. I have physical copies of the various versions of Bruce's PowerShell book and a couple other ones. But did I buy the physical? I may have bought the physical copy of the new month of lunches that is focusing on PowerShell core. I think I did. Anyway.
Yeah, I tend to not buy physical copies myself. One reason is just that e-copies tend to provide more royalties. So specifically for our Lean Pub, which we're planning to do a physical copy, probably through Amazon Publishing. We're still working some kinks out on that.
Okay.
But the royalties that you get from a physical copy are so much lower. And for something like this, that it goes to a charitable cause, it's kind of like really pretty important for us. But I'm not going to begrudge anybody who's going to buy the physical book, and I'm definitely not going to turn away anyone who wants my signature. So.
That's cool. So I think that's all I have got for you. Do you have anything else that you would like to talk about before I ask you the final question?
No, I think that's it. Just pick up your copy of the PowerShell Conference book today. And if you haven't bought the first one, you can still buy that one. It's still supporting the same cause too. And help us get more people into the on-ramp program.
So what's the best way for people to find out when you open, what do you even call that? The submissions for the third volume?
Yeah, it would be to either follow me at Marky Kraus on Twitter or the PowerShell.org Twitter account, and to keep your eye out on PowerShell.org for updates there as well. And
are you still blogging these days?
I haven't written a blog in a long time.
Okay.
It's difficult. Sometimes some of the stuff that I'm doing, I have to judge whether or not I can talk about it without going through reviews at work.
Sure.
So it makes it kind of difficult. So sometimes I just err on the side of caution and don't.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, cool. Mm-hmm. If we have any listeners in Bangalore, maybe we'll get to meet Mark in person.
Yeah.
Hopefully. I think I would enjoy traveling to India sometime. I have so many coworkers who are from various parts of India, and some of the culture stuff just fascinates me, like the languages that are so tightly regional that, two people who live or who grew up 100 miles apart may not speak the same language at all, and probably don't unless they both speak English, which is just fascinating. It's like if, meeting somebody from Alabama and not being able to communicate with them.
It is very much like that. But most people can speak English, so that's pretty interesting. It was a blast though. If you ever have a chance to go out there, I'll be honest, I had never traveled outside the U.S. except just across the border into Mexico and Canada.
Okay.
Before this, so my experience with any other cultures and countries was pretty limited. And I went to Bangalore for the first time, and I was just blown away. It's a complete trip. It's awesome. But it's way outside my expectations. I didn't know what I was expecting, and it blew me away. I had a really great time. I'm looking forward to going back. Just don't drink the water.
Yeah. I've heard the pollution can be bad too.
In Bangalore, especially, the Outer Ring Road, which is kind of where I was staying by, is like a constant stream of traffic 24/7, and the pollution is pretty bad.
Yeah, there was one day, I don't remember why. I think I may have been on a call with somebody in Bangalore, and just for fun, I looked up the weather, and on my weather app, it said, where it normally says, like rain or sun or something, it said smoke. I was like, oh my gosh, that can't be healthy.
It's a trip though. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to going back.
That's great. So I'm trying to remember. I haven't been great about asking the questions that we normally do at the end of the show. Hal's been better. But I do remember the first one, which was, Mark, what was your first computer?
It was a leading edge Model D. I remember it quite fondly.
What in the world is a leading edge Model D?
Exactly. It is, it had a whopping 4 megabyte hard drive.
Wow.
And I think like 12K RAM. It ran DOS. I think it was DOS 2.
So it was an IBM clone. What we used to call IBM clones back then.
An x86 IBM clone. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And it was a huge beast. And my parents only got rid of it about 6 years ago.
You're kidding.
We had it sitting around, and it still ran. It still worked. I had a couple of games on it. I had a couple of QBasic programs that I wrote as a child as well on there. So that was my first computer.
Wasn't there some QBasic game where you threw bananas at buildings or something?
Yeah, gorillas, and you threw bananas at each other if you did the 2-player mode.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't think I knew there was a 2-player mode. That's cool. So what's your most recent computer?
It's a custom-built PC. It's a gaming rig.
Are you a gamer?
Yeah. So some of the other things that I do is I stream when I'm coding or when I'm gaming, both. So
okay.
Kind of do that both on Twitch, twitch.tv/Mark E. Kraus. But it's a custom gaming rig. It's about 2 years old now, so it's not the greatest rig on the planet, but at the time it was definitely the boss. So now it's about 2 generations behind on graphics cards. But it's got a whopping 24 threads, so I can run a bunch of containers and VMs on my system when I'm not gaming.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
That's cool. So how do you feel about the new game streaming stuff that's coming, where you're basically just getting the images and all the graphics hardware is in the cloud?
I think that's an interesting thing, and I think that I remember remote desktop very well, and I don't know. I
Video
think
didn't work so well.
I mean, we've had lots of those kind of streaming things for a while, where you could run them like with Steam, sorry, where you could run it from your PC. So you could have a gaming rig, and then you could play on any TV in the house with kind of a minimal client. So that's kind of been around for a while.
Yeah, my son had one of those boxes.
I think the input lag is the huge problem. So a lot of games that require precise timed input, sending those inputs from the controller to the PC is sometimes too slow for people. Okay. Imagine sending it from your controller to the PC, then to the cloud. Yeah, that's a serious latency problem.
Especially for something that's competitive. I don't see how that's going to work, but I don't know. Well, I guess they do. I mean, all that stuff gets aggregated in the cloud now so that your opponent can see your movements. I don't know.
Yeah, that's more of how they track. There's a lot of tomfoolery they do to make that look pretty real time. Okay. But even for single player games that require that kind of precision is another thing.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming on. It was great to talk to you again. I'm sad I'm not going to see you at Summit.
Oh, yeah, I'm sad I won't be there too.
But I hope you have fun in India and eat some wonderful food.
Oh, there's nothing but wonderful food in India. So that's cool. That's the best thing.
All right.
And thanks for having me. I appreciate you having me on. And I hope everyone got something out of this.
Oh, I think so. Thank you very much.
No problem.